Welcome to the Apartment Operators Podcast, where you can learn from experienced operators what it really means to be an apartment operator. No fluff, no sugarcoating, just the raw, unfiltered truth of the ups and downs of operating multifamily communities.
Hey everybody, Joseph Gozlan with the Operators Podcast, and today we have Brian Murry. Brian is a published author, a very successful one. We'll put a link in the show notes to his awesome book about apartments. It's called Crushing It. And thank you for joining us today, Brian.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be on your show.
It's all of our pleasure here. Why won't you give a few minutes to the audience so they'll know who you are, what your background, and what you're doing today?
Sure. I started my apartment investing back in 2007, so it's been 12 years. I was actually working as a teacher at the time and trying to figure out a way to make some extra income. And I'd always been interested in real estate. So I got out there, started looking at properties and started slowly looking at bigger and bigger ones. And I actually made a little bit of an unusual start. I jumped in with a pretty large office building right out of the gate. And I did self-manage, and I really had no idea what I was doing, but I figured it out as I went. And it took me a couple of years to turn that property around. And but I learned how to add value to properties. I learned how to manage properties, and I started buying additional ones. And I did the same thing. I bought retail, and then I started buying multifamily, and more we've been moving into multifamily. So at this point, we've got a pretty large portfolio. We're based out of upstate New York. About 2/3 of our properties now are multifamily. And we still operate all of our own properties. The other thing that's probably a little bit atypical, we actually don't have any investors, so we haven't raised outside money to this point. Looking to the future, we've reached a size where it's become harder to grow organically and maintain the growth rate that got us here. So we may be raising capital in the future, but for now, we're still haven't taken outside money.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that. And you mentioned that you self-manage, right? That's one of the questions we ask all of our guests. Do you self-manage or do you use third party? What led to the decision to self-manage?
Well, I think it was by necessity. You know, I'm not in a very large market, and the very first property that I got, I assumed the mortgage on that property. That's primarily how I got into a sizable property without having a lot of money to put down. And the lender at the time insisted that as part of the conditions of assuming that I did find a property manager, and I looked really hard and I just wasn't happy with the options I was finding. Eventually I settled on a property manager from outside of the area who basically agreed to do our bookkeeping and allow me to manage kind of under their umbrella. And we kept that arrangement for a couple of years, and they just charged a nominal fee. And at that point, I reached a spot that I could refinance that mortgage and get rid of them, and I've managed ever since. But even when it was under their umbrella, I was pretty much doing everything. So yeah, that's kind of the backdrop in terms of how I ended up doing that. It really weren't options that I was particularly happy with.
And what if there were options? Would you still make the same decision?
Well, knowing what I know now, I think I would. The challenge is what I've come to find out is you just can't expect someone else to manage your property the way you would. There's really no substitute for that. Even when you find a good property manager, and when you do, they're worth their weight in gold. But you know, it's a challenge. No one is ever going to look at a property quite the same way as an owner will. And I think even in situations where in the future I may be using third-party property management, I'll expect to keep a close eye on things because I think that's necessary.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. I think it's worth repeating the statement of nobody's going to look at your property the way you do. So we work with third-party property management, but we keep a very close eye on everything. We look at the reports. We talk to the people in the field. We do surveys direct to the residents, right? So we keep a very close look because I like to say that you make your money when you buy, but you lose your money on operations, right? So that's why it's important to keep operation tight, regardless of who's managing.
Yeah,
So
I think the other thing that's worth mentioning is that if you do want to have third-party property management, you're going to be able to manage those third parties much better if you've got a little bit of experience doing it yourself. And I think a lot of people they look at it in reverse. They say, well, I don't know how to do it, so I'll hire somebody and then I'll learn. But I would actually encourage people to flip that on its head and say, I'm going to dive in there and I'm going to learn it so that I can manage property managers well down the road.
yeah, I agree with that. I'll just put one caveat. It works well when you have a 10, 20 unit property, but if you're jumping in on your first transaction to 100 plus, I wouldn't try to self-manage that one.
That's true. A lender might not let you.
Yeah, that's a different conversation, right?
Yep.
So, how many units total right now do you have under management?
We've got around 600 residential and about another 100 commercial. So we're around 700 total in the portfolio.
What would you say is your biggest operational challenge these days? Because 600 plus 100, that's a sizable operation. And I'm sure you have quite a few people working for you. What's the biggest challenge?
I'd say the biggest challenge is just, it's not even unique to real estate. It's finding good people. It's people management. It's dealing with all the drama that comes with that. I think that any business owner out there can probably tell the same stories, whether they're in retail or real estate or something completely different. Once you've got that many people, there's just a lot of headaches that can come with that. And I feel very fortunate. I feel like I've got a pretty good team, but we've had turnover and had the same experiences that other business owners have. And in property management, you get you have by necessity quite a few hourly workers, and sometimes those positions tend to have higher turnover.
Yeah, it's interesting how your challenges are very similar to our challenges. Even though we use third party, we still have challenges with hiring and finding the right people and the high turnover. So that problem exceeds having a third party manager or not. Granted, they do a lot of the hiring and they deal with a lot of the drama, but it's still part of our operation and our outlook at things. So if you don't mind, let's take a couple of examples of properties that you had in the past. If you can share one win and one horror stories, because I'm sure you have those. Everybody have those.
Yeah. Gosh. Well, maybe I'll start with a horror story because there's more to choose from. No, we have our share of. What I tell people is we're making mistakes and learning things every day, and we have our little wins every day. And some are bigger than others. It's just perpetual, and so there is a lot to choose from there on both sides. I would say one of the biggest mistakes we made came right on the heels of one of our greatest success stories. So we had two different multifamily properties that we purchased at auction. One right after the other. So the first one that we purchased at auction, I actually chronicle that one in my book. And that was a very distressed 5-story multifamily building. The apartment building was, it really was in rough shape. The very dark interiors, the lights were smashed out. There's a lot of drug activity in there. It really had been let go pretty bad. And, we were able to step in, take that property over. We actually temporarily relocated our management office into the building because I knew that there was a lot of tendency to kind of look the other way and not want to deal head on with some of the things that were there. But we worked through it. We lit the place up inside and out. We put security cameras everywhere, and we just started making improvements and worked our way through the tenants that were doing things they weren't supposed to, weren't happy to see all those lights and security cameras, and the tenants that were fine were happy to see that. And so, I think one of the things we learned from that was that a lot of that stuff sorts itself out. You know, people don't want to, if they're doing something they're not supposed to be doing, they don't want that presence. They don't want that going on. And a lot of them just chose to up and leave on their own. It wasn't all that smooth. You know, we definitely had our challenges, and I walked through that, but it was a great project. And, you know, we were able to create a property that was valued at more than, you know, when it was appraised, we refinanced it a few years after we bought it, and it appraised at more than double what we paid for it. So we were very happy with that. But you know, that project was underway and going well, and everything looked good. And we had another opportunity to do a similar one, and we did the same thing. We went in, we bought it at auction. It was distressed. But in this case, we learned a really hard lesson and realized how fortunate we were with the first one, that when we got in and we started doing the work, we kept uncovering things behind the walls that we hadn't been aware was there. And we ended up tearing everything out. We didn't anticipate that. We completely gutted it and ended up putting in all new mechanicals and even making some structural repairs, and had some environmental remediation. It was pretty much anything you could think of that could have been in there, hidden behind those walls, was there. We powered through. We got the project done, but it had that one had a main building with 20 units, and it had it was an older building, and it had an old carriage house out back that had another 8 units in it, and we ended up tearing that building down instead of continuing to hemorrhage money into that project. In the end, it's a beautiful property, but I don't think we'll ever get back what we put into it.
Yeah, so really great lessons here. I wanted to dive into some of them a little bit. The first one, you decided to move your office into it, and I want to learn a little bit more about that decision, because I do believe that proximity is power. And I kind of made it a little bit you made me laugh a little bit with the once you put the security lights and all that. It's kind of like when you shine a light on the dark corner, usually all the rats run away, right?
That's right.
So what led you to move your office in there, and how do you think this would end up if you were not physically in the building?
When we realized we won the auction, I still remember sitting down in a conference room with my team and talking about our options and how we were going to handle this. And the unanimous consensus around the table was keep the property manager on. This is one we don't want to manage ourselves. And that's right then I knew that this wasn't going to work. So I don't normally do this. I weigh the input from my team very carefully, but I actually put my foot down and I said, no, this needs a complete overhaul. We need to be doing this. We can't do that. That's the easy way out. It's not the right way to do this. It's not going to be successful unless there's a change. Seeing how, you know, what I saw in that meeting was an aversion to confronting things. That there was going to be conflict. It was going to be uncomfortable. There were too many excuses that people would have to work on something else or look the other way or procrastinate when there's something that challenging. And I felt like physically locating ourselves in the building made that impossible, because everything was right there in your face. You would see the tenants, you would see what was going on. The good tenants would walk downstairs with concerns or complaints and speak right to us. And we had enough contractors in there, and with our office in there, that there were people all over the place, and all those things that would go on, you know, without any observation in the past, they couldn't happen anymore. And I do think moving in there was in hindsight, definitely the best decision. It was a highly effective approach, and you know, it worked out in this case.
Awesome. That's great. And then with the other one, the one that you had to tear down a lot of things, was there anything you could have done otherwise? Hindsight looking, right? Everybody's smarter hindsight.
Right.
Anything you could have done? I know it's an auction, so I don't know if you had access to it before or not. Anything you could have done to figure out these things before you actually bought it and started tearing down walls?
So you're absolutely right. When you buy at auction, oftentimes you don't have access. We had very limited access, and in both cases. So In the first case, we actually had a tenant let us in and walk around. In the second case, the front door wasn't locked. And so we were able to kind of poke around and look around, but not do a thorough inspection. So the price we paid for that was that we weren't aware of a lot of the problems that were in there. And so I think the real lesson learned wasn't necessarily not to buy things at auction, but when you do that, to do it recognizing and accepting the fact that those problems could and very well may exist. And you got to factor that into your price and into your budget. If you can't get that access, you have to assume the worst.
Yes, that's a perfect access. It's a perfect statement right there. If you don't know it, it's easier to assume the worst than to handle with the aftermath, right?
Exactly.
Okay, great. I want to circle back to the conversation about hiring people. What do you guys do when you need to hire people in your organization? Do you have a certain process? Do you guys use any psychological tests? What is your process?
Well, we've tried a lot of different things. We try to get candidates in front of as many people as possible. But if I have to think through sort of what's effective and what's not, I think, and this goes not only in my experience in real estate, but in prior to that as well. I think probably most of our best hires over the years have been from referrals. So the number one thing I would say that we do is talk to everybody on staff and see, hey, do you know somebody? Is there someone you've worked with in the past that you could vouch for or that might be interested? And don't limit your pool to people who are actively looking. So what I'll do is I'll talk to somebody on the team and I'll go, I don't care if they're looking or not. Think about the last place you worked. Who were the stars there? Like, tell me who they are. Let's reach out to them. Let's invite them in, see if they'll have a conversation. Because unfortunately, a lot of people who are good at what they do are focused on their job instead of out looking for other opportunities. And, sometimes you got to actively go to them and pull them away. And so, it's kind of like finding properties, right? Like, not all the good properties are for sale, but everything's for sale for the right price. So if you go and knock on a door and you talk to somebody just because they weren't planning to sell, you may have planted a seed. They might come back to you later, or they might actually engage in a conversation on the spot. So I think employees are really similar in that respect.
That's a great tip. Thank you for that. So we have in our industry, we have a lot of compliance regulations, fair housing rules, and so on. How do you keep your team updated and up to code, if you want to call it this way, with all the regulations and compliance?
We've got a great property manager who stays on top of that stuff for us. And, she will educate new hires. We've had a professional come in to deliver a training to staff. And, we try to do the best we can with that.
Are you using any certain system, or you're just keep training every once in a while to make sure everybody is current?
Yep. Yeah. Just keep everybody trained.
Okay. Do you do any fee management for other people, other owners?
No. Just our own properties. Yep.
Yeah. That makes sense. Some people do that. I honestly find it really challenging to think about managing other people's property. It sounds like a lot of work and not a lot of gain. So, yeah. Sorry.
Yep. Oh no, yeah, a lot. There's so much that goes into it. I think it's money hard earned. So I think there's if you're going to manage properties well, I think you'll have a lot of business for yourself. In my opinion, probably the best reward for that could be leads on properties that you might eventually acquire yourself. But the margins are narrow, and it's definitely not a part of our business that we're looking to grow.
Yeah, that makes sense. So do you do any special events for your residents, or any like pool parties, or I don't know, some people do donuts in the mornings, and what do you guys do for your residents?
So That's not something we do really in our properties. I know that that's done more widely. We really haven't gone in that direction. Most of our communities are not A class or even B class. It's mostly, I'd say, C plus communities, workforce housing, and it's just not something we've had to do, and we're content to not spend that extra money doing that.
Okay. Well, C-class residents like parties too.
That's true. That's true. There's a lot of things they like. We're not going to pay for them all.
Yes. Just a little tip from our operations, right? We have C-class properties too. And when we want to do like a pool party, something like that, we reach out to vendors in the area, and they usually come in and sponsor, or they'll bring a booth or something. They'll donate presents, like gift cards and stuff like that. So you can do these things on a relatively low budget, and it's definitely helping with the engagement with the residents. So if you guys don't do events or stuff like that, do you have anything you do to keep retention high?
I would say that the number one thing we do is we've developed a reputation for great customer service and taking care of our properties. And in the communities that we operate, people recognize that if they want to live someplace where it's going to be well tended to, and if they have any concerns, they're going to be addressed. That's what sets us apart from the competition.
Yeah, no, that at the end of the day, most people want just a safe, clean place to live in, that when you need something, you're getting taken care of, right? So if that's the reputation you were able to build in your community, then that makes a lot of sense why you will have retention and you'll stay full and so on. Okay. So what about that? Sorry. What about value add projects? You mentioned the one that you have in your book, and you mentioned the one that was not so great. So when you look at a project that is a value add, how do you approach it? How do you decide what's worth it, what's not worth it, where you should spend money, where you should not spend money? Help me with what goes through your head.
Yeah, I think a lot of it's based on experience, but we'll look both at the income side and at the expense side very carefully. And there's just a lot of opportunities usually surrounding the rent, particularly, I would say, like, even to raise it up a level, the best value add properties are, I would say, properties that are poorly managed. And so the more poorly managed the property is, the more excited we get when we look at it. And that's often an inattentive owner. It's usually third-party management. It's often somebody that doesn't live nearby or ever visit the property. It might be out of touch with the local market conditions. So I know one of the most common ways to raise value would be to raise rents, but honestly, just as often we go into a value add project and lower rents. And you don't really hear people talking about that, but it really depends on the market you're in. So if you're in a high growth market and you're fortunate enough to be in that environment where rents are rapidly growing, you're much more likely to raise rents. But if you're in a slow growth market or even a declining market, a lot of times the rents that the owner might be charging are too high. And so if you can, for example, lowering rents by, say, 5% might result in a 10% increase in occupancy. And then you're driving up your rental income by lowering rents. And so there's been a number of occasions that's worked well for us, that we'll actually go in and actually we're actually working on turning around a project right now that had about 55% occupancy. And the first thing we did is we went in and we slashed the rents because the owners were out of touch with the local market. They didn't really understand that, hey, the rents were way too high. And we bought that project November 30th, and we are 4 months later or five months later, and we're up in the upper 70s in terms of occupancy. And the number one thing we did was to lower rents. But we're always looking at expenses as well. We want to try to make investments that are going to be long-term, not afraid to spend the money up front if it means it's going to hold expenses down longer term. So, and that there's dozens and dozens of areas that we would look at with something like that. So yeah, just looking at all opportunities on both sides, both the income and on the expense side.
Yeah. So thank you. I think you had really good points in that. So I want to kind of reiterate a couple of them. The occupancy versus rate is always a balance, right? They both pull different ways. The higher the rates, the lower the occupancy, and so on. A common mistake I've seen people do in their underwriting is finding a property that is occupied higher than market, right? So if, let's say the market is at 90%, the property is occupied at 95%, but the rates are below market. And in their underwriting, they underwrite that the rates will go back to market, but they don't bring the occupancy back to market, right? And then that's double dipping, and you can't really get that. So I think your approach of let's put the rents a little bit lower so we can get the occupancy really shows the understanding of these two are pulling in different directions. And so that's great. And definitely having occupancy means there's more income coming in, which allows you to do more with the property. Can you give us, 3 top ways to reduce expenses? Stuff that you like to do?
Wow. There's a lot to choose from. One of them I mentioned already, which is the cameras. More and more we're going to that fairly quickly. And a lot of that has to do with, we've taken on a lot of distressed properties. Like we like to create value with properties that are poorly managed, but installing cameras throughout a property really can change the behavior and reduce the amount of damage in the property and abuses, people, abandoning things in the hallways or throwing extra stuff in the dumpster or doing different things that are going to cost you money. And frankly, it discourages the tenants who are bad tenants from living there. So, early on, putting those cameras in, I think usually gets us over the long run a great return in terms of driving down expenses. One that I learned a lesson on took me 10 years to figure this out. But we went through and different times we've made, we make a lot of insurance claims. And what I began to realize is that, so often when something would happen at a property and we would go and we would say, well, what's the damage? And we would talk about whether to submit the claim or not. And I just began to realize that over time, we really had determined that pretty much any claim less than about $15,000 wasn't worth it to submit because our insurance rates would go up and we wouldn't end up ahead by submitting claims that were that low. And so at a certain point in time, I realized that, hey, we basically stopped submitting insurance claims for less than between $10,000 and $15,000, yet all of our insurance deductibles were at $5,000. So we went back through and raised all of our insurance deductibles up to anywhere from $15,000 to $25,000, and we saved our company about $100,000 a year. Making all those changes. So I think that's talking to investors, especially ones that are starting to build a portfolio and have enough doors to weather the storm, enough reserves to weather the storm if they need to come up with an unexpected $10,000. They might want to take a look and make sure that they've got the right, and they're not overinsured, paying for coverage that you don't need, because insurance costs keep rising. And one way to get those rates down a little lower is carry a high deductible.
That's a fantastic tip. I've never heard that one. So
this, there, like I said, there's just dozens and dozens of different things that we do. One thing that's a little unique that we do, and almost every property we buy, we end up when we rekey, we always take the locks out of passage knobs on the doors. And what we realize is if we only have a deadbolt on all the apartment doors and we don't have keys in the passage knobs, the lockouts practically disappear. It becomes practically impossible to lock yourself out. The most common lockout is when you've got the passage knob locked on and you walk out and then you close it and you realize you don't have your key.
Yep.
You can't lock your door unless you have your key from the exterior when you only have the deadbolt. And I would say almost every apartment community that we've acquired has had the locks in the passage knobs, so we'll eliminate that. And so we're always trying to think of things the little things like that pay you back later. And, like we don't like to see, garbage disposals. And so what do? We, instead of fix them, we just take them out, unless it's required, by whatever, water sewer district you're in. But in the cases that we haven't had anything that's obligated us to keep them, and the tenants don't seem to care. So we'll take those out. And then, because there's certain things that just end up taking a lot of labor,
Yep.
Whether it's ice makers or, there's just garbage disposals. There's certain things that tend to break and can be expensive to fix. So we try to avoid those.
Yeah, so that's great. We do the same with the garbage disposal, but not in all of our communities, right? Some of the communities are a little bit nicer, and the people want the garbage disposals. In the lower end communities, people don't care, so we just eliminate them. We haven't done that, but I've seen some owners, usually it's in the C- kind of class. They take away the dishwashers because the residents don't use them. They use them as cabinets. So they just store stuff in them. So they started eliminating the dishwashers and put in just a cabinet in there. Okay, great. So if you went back in time to Brian in 2007, what would be the best advice you can give?
Oh, well, I would say set your fears aside and stop worrying that you might make mistakes, because you're going to, but that's okay. What does our friend Rod Khleif call them? Seminars.
Seminars, yes.
Seminars. So that's what they are. And managing a property yourself is an opportunity to have a seminar every day and get some education. So, I think if you're thinking about being an operator and you haven't taken that step, I think you go for it. And, to be successful, I think, I would say two things to keep in mind. One would be, try to be as proactive as you can instead of reactive. I think property managers tend to fall somewhere on a spectrum there. And unfortunately, when budgets are tight, you find yourself always reacting. You're always like trying to solve problems. And then that doesn't leave you the opportunity to get out in front of things and to try to push as hard as you can to stay on the forefront of being proactive and preventing the problems from happening to begin with.
Management by crisis, right?
Yeah. And I think the other thing is that one of the problems that's really pervasive in the industry is that property managers and property management companies often develop this poor culture where it's really an us versus them mentality with the tenants. And I actually think it was an advantage that I didn't have property management experience when I started. Before I was teaching, I worked in customer service area in a technology company. And I just had that mentality that, hey, these are not tenants, they're customers, and they are the ones who's paying the bills, and we're providing a service for them, and you have to think about them as customers and you have to treat them that way. And it's a challenge. I've hired people who have experience in property management, and it's, they often have that us versus them mentality. And I have to make sure that that's not carried into my company. We want to create a culture that's service oriented. And if you can do that successfully, that gives you a competitive advantage. It's not easy to do, but yeah, just think about your tenants as customers, because that's what they are.
Yeah, I know that's another great gold nugget in this show. We don't call them tenants; we call them residents, right? And every time I get a chance to talk to our on-site staff, I keep reminding them that the people that pay their salaries is not the property management. It's not me. It's the guys out there in the units, right? So I tell them it's like a JC Penney. You walk in and you walk by an associate, they'll lift their head, they'll smile and say, "Hey, can I help you today?" Right? Did you find everything okay? I tell the same thing to our leasing agents and to our maintenance guys. You walk down a path and a resident comes across your way, lift your head, smile, wish them a great day, ask if there's anything you can do for them, because these are the guys that pay your salary. So it takes a while. You're right. There's a lot of us versus them mentality out there. But kindness doesn't cost money. And if you're kind, you can be firm and kind. You can be demanding and kind, but kind should be one of the ground qualities you want from your on-site staff and anyone that interacts with the residents.
Yep. And we talked about a variety of things, and for someone that's just getting started or early in the process, the adding value and the taking care of the property, it doesn't have to be complicated either. And some of probably the number one thing that I look at right out of the gate is making a property clean, painting it, landscaping. And a lot of that, when I first started out, I would do that myself. And it doesn't, maybe to do it at a professional level, I don't have those skills, of course, but I can paint, and I can do some basic landscaping, and I can clean. And if you do those things, it really can make a property a world of difference. And you'll find that'll have probably an even better return than some of the more complicated things that we already discussed. So, going back, I probably reassure myself at an early age that, hey, these are things you can do. You can go out and you can do these things, and you can be successful, and you can do it as well as somebody else, and you can learn as you go for the things that are more complicated. And there's always other people you can talk to for advice.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Brian, this has been fantastic. A lot of great information and gold nuggets here. I want you to take a couple more minutes and tell the audience where they can find you, where they can get your book, which is phenomenal and highly recommended. We'll have links at the show notes, but tell us how we can find you.
Sure. You could find me on either LinkedIn or Facebook. You could find my website at WashingtonStreetProperties.com. And my book, which is Crushing It in Apartments and Commercial Real Estate. The easiest way to find that is right on Amazon.com. And, if any of your listeners read that book and have questions at the end, they're welcome to reach out to me through LinkedIn or Facebook. I'm always glad to answer questions. But that was a 2-year project that I really was motivated to try to share everything I've learned in my journey with people who want to try to do the same thing. And everything I could think of that might be helpful to somebody, I put into that book. So hopefully some of your listeners will find that to be a good resource.
Yeah, I know it was great to read for me, and I highly recommend it for everybody. Thank you so much, Brian, for being our guest today. And for everybody else, we'll see you in the next chapter.
Thanks, Joseph. Take care.
Take care.